Hello everyone, welcome to Lecture 9, Military Spending and the International Arms Trade. Okay, take a quick moment to look at that quote. So true that really. I wonder if leaders of countries ever really think about that. It would be interesting. Be interesting to know. Okay, let's go. I wanted to show you this cartoon just to get you guys in the mood. Very interesting cartoon from Polyp. They do a number of actually very interesting cartoons if you're interested about this kind of thing. Arms, money, the growth of the arms trade. Oh, all those bones in the soil. Excellent cartoon though. Okay, important information as we usually do. In week 10, remember it's an online tutorial. In week 10, there's no face-to-face tutorial this week because I'm at the conference, remember, but there is a quick quiz that you must do under week 9 on Moodle. It does count for tutorial attendance, so if you don't do it, you will be marked absent on pass for this TUT. Plus, it's a very quick quiz, really, so it's sort of 6 or 7 questions. You only have to read 1 or 2 articles that are quite brief, if you know where to look in them for the information. And the information is important for the exam, so it's in your best interest to do this. Please don't just skip over it. Okay, there are only 3 weeks left of the semester, everyone, so hang in there. Remember that quiz 2, which does count for grades, 2.5% of the overall grade, runs next week from the 8th to 10th of October. And the content that is covered is from weeks 6 to 9. So it includes military spending, but it's not including South African content. Remember that there's a guest lecture coming this week, Thursday, the 4th of October. Former Colonel in South African Defence Force, Colonel Robbie Blake, now Mr. Robbie Blake, who will be talking to you guys about South African defence history and armaments. And that will be followed by Professor Annemar van Wyk, who is our very own Dean, who will talk to you guys about South African nuclear history and also present-day nuclear status, etc. So that is a very important class on the 4th of October. Please make sure you're there for that one. Then also, so you know, the SETU surveys are out now for all units. Just as you're always reminded every semester, please fill that in. Don't wait too long to do that. It's about 10 minutes, I think, max to fill them in, depending on how much you want to write, of course. And then the exam scope for this unit is released on the 1st of October. So that will already have been released by the time you guys see this lecture. So please have a look at it. We will discuss this in TUTS though in week 11, which is the last of the face-to-face tutorials, but nothing's to stop you from going now and looking at the exam scope. It releases under the assessment tab on Moodle, and it's also releasing under, I think, week 11 on Moodle as well. Your exam is on Tuesday the 30th of October at 1 o'clock. The venue is still to be confirmed. Alright, sources for today's lecture. See Moodle generally, as I always say, for the whole range of sources, but the most important ones here are really from the CIPRI yearbook, 2012 to 2017 and 2018, and here are some links there to where you can access information around those, and then also some video clips that I'll be showing you as well. Here is the outline for today's lecture. We'll do a quick introduction, followed by a brief sort of introduction on military economics and what it means, then the international arms trade, which consists of a discussion of the arms trade itself, but then also the illegal arms trade, and we'll do a quick case study on Pakistan's Islamic bomb. Okay, so by way of introduction, if we look back over discussions that we had over the past few weeks, it's obviously quite evident there are a range of military capabilities that are available to states, as well as to non-state actors, right? So there are various weapons of mass destruction, as we know. There are also several kinds of small and arms and light weapons and conventional weapons that exist. And these capabilities obviously come at various different costs. So the question for state leaders specifically is sort of how much is it going to be and what types of weapons should we acquire, right? So that's what you're thinking as a state leader. And today, what we'll look at first is what we can call, or what we refer to as legal military economics, or military spending by legal international actors, followed by legal as well as illegal international arms trade discussions. So to start off with, let's look at the magnitude of military spending in the world today. Overall, basically, world military spending decreased by about a third in the 1990s, but slowly started to increase again after 1998, and then it jumped back to about 1/4 by 2001. And world military spending generally is about 2% of the total goods and services in the world economy, which is about $1.2 trillion every year, roughly about $1 million every 30 seconds, which is really quite remarkable if you think about it. The USA and China make up they make up half of all the military spending, and then the rest of them are other big states, which I'll show you just now in a slide. But basically, today, world military expenditure has risen to about $1,739 billion in 2017, or $1.7 trillion, with a marginal increase of 1.1% in real terms from 2016. So what I want to do is show you a couple of graphs so you can understand what I'm talking about here for real. Okay, so have a look at this. Military expenditure from 1988 to about 2017, which is the latest data we can get from SIPRI. Look at that, it's huge. So there's a bit of a decrease we saw there in the 1990s, then it goes back up, and then now it's like very, very big. Okay, now let's see if this will work. I'm going to access the internet quickly and show you a couple of graphs. Okay, so here we are at, this is the SIPRI online site. So you can see there, hopefully you can get that in at the top there, but there's also the URL at the bottom of the slide. But have a look at this. So here we are with the world military expenditure, and then if we go to the next one, the share of world military expenditure of the 15 states with the highest spending in 2017. You can see there, as I mentioned before, the USA and China make up a huge chunk of this. The USA with 35% and China with 13%. And then you have the rest of the states, the rest of the biggie states. So Saudi Arabia with 4, Russia with 3.8, India 3.7, France 3.3, the UK 2.7, then Japan, Germany, South Korea, and then Brazil, Italy, Australia, Canada, Turkey, etc. And the others, 20% of other countries make up that last bit. Then let's go into the next one. Have a look at this. Changes in military expenditure by sub-region. So if you look at what it's showing here on this graph is how many countries or how many regions have spent more and how many have spent less. So that's the amount that they've spent in military expenditure has changed between 2016 and 2017. So in the world generally, there's been an increase in military expenditure. Yay, how great is that? North Africa, there's actually been a decrease. Sub-Saharan Africa, also a decrease. It looks like minus, what is that if we go down here? Maybe -7 or something, -7 there, 7% possibly. And then if you've got North America, just a tiny amount. But South America, an increase in military expenditure. Also in Asia, Central and South Asia, East Asia, a bit of a decrease in Oceania. Southeast Asia, tiny bit of an increase. Central Europe, huge, massive. Eastern Europe, wow, massive decrease. And then Western Europe, sort of a minor-ish increase in military expenditure. Have a look here again at the top global spenders. So there just proves the point about USA, China, and then the next highest, Saudi Arabia, Russia, India, and then basically the rest of the world. Here's just presented again in a different way. Wow, you can really see it the way it looks here. That's huge. So look at the sides of the circles. Massive. USA and China again you see there, and then again Saudi Arabia, Russia, India, South Korea. Another interesting graph here. This is military spending as a percentage of GDP, so your gross domestic product of a country. So here we've got, for example, Russia. It's 4.0% or more of its GDP is military spending. That's interesting. These red or maroony countries here. That would make sense actually. And then you see the rest. Okay. We carry on. I mean, you can have a look at all of these if you want to. There's quite a number of different slides and graphs going on here. So please do go onto this link and have a look for yourself. All of this data will be interesting. Okay, but just remember that you obviously have a limited time in your exam to be able to explain all of this. So you want to be able to pick and choose the most important facts, I think. Okay, so we've come out of those graphs now. And now we're moving on to here. I just wanted to reiterate this point. The 5 largest arms suppliers in 2013 to 2017 were the US, Russia, France, Germany, and China. Those are the largest arms suppliers, okay, accounting for 74% of the total global volume of exports of major weapons. And then the top 5 arms importers were India, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and China. And they together accounted for 35% of total arms imports. So if you look at international military spending, obviously states vary widely depending on the kind of state they are. For example, Costa Rica has virtually no spending on military at all, while on the other end of the spectrum one finds North Korea, which devotes sort of like 20% or more of all economic activity to military purposes. All right? So obviously states differ. And the danger of having no or limited military budgets is that states obviously could be unprepared to meet a security threat. And that's something that states are obviously concerned about. I mean, if we look at it from a realistic principle, they may even be overrun. They could be conquered militarily. But on the other hand, if leaders set military budgets too high, then they'll overburden the national economy in the long run. And, you know, some of that money could be used elsewhere, like infrastructure or hospitals or something like that. So If we quickly summarize this, basically, world military spending is such a huge flow of money that it could change the world profoundly, right? And it could improve major world problems if some of it even could be directed to other purposes. But are governments going to do that? Not necessarily, because it all comes back down to this issue of security threat. Remember back to week 1 or 2 where we spoke about the security dilemma? Yes, exactly. So this world, right, it does not spend this money or even choose how to direct it. And my emphasis is on the world here. It doesn't spend this money, right? It's firmly in the hands of individual states. So while states are governed by this fear of other states, then they're always going to be worried about military arming instead of fixing the world's problems around disease and all sorts of other issues, poverty, inequality, etc. So if we look now at an overview of post-Cold War spending, then when we look at that area in particular, or that era in particular, US leaders had cut military spending to reap what is called a peace dividend, right? In other words, a peace dividend means more money for cities, for education, for the environment, for other pieces of the pie kind of thing in the sectors in society. And so after the Cold War, the savings amounted to an estimated $100 billion and did help to reduce the US budget deficit at the time. And in addition then, US citizens and politicians began to demand this concept of burden sharing. And this is the point in the class what I would have said to you guys. What does burden sharing mean? Okay, so basically it means this idea that prosperous US allies in Europe and Japan should pay more for maintaining US military forces there. So sharing the burden of that cost, right? So it's also known as the collective goods principle. Now at the same time, Russia and the other former Soviet republics, remember we're calling it Russia now because we're talking post-Cold War, they drastically curtailed military spending, and we understand why. If anybody here knows about post-Cold War, the Cold War history, Russia was in tatters and the USSR was in tatters, and so all of their former states would also have been in tatters by the end of the Cold War, and so these overburdened economies couldn't support it. So it makes sense, logically, that there would be a drastically curtailed military spending in Russia and in the former Soviet republics. But it didn't help much to stop the economic free fall of Russia and the former satellite states at the time. Basically, it ushered in a process called economic conversion, which is the use of former military facilities and industries for new civilian production. And the same thing happened to a lesser extent in Europe and in the US as well. Overall, military spending after the Cold War basically dropped most dramatically in the former Soviet Union, with less dramatic cutbacks, I would say, in Western Europe, where NATO members spent several percent of GDP on military forces, right? But in Japan, military spending was, in any case, only 1% of GDP by the end of the Cold War, so dramatic cutbacks were not even really necessary there. I mean, it was only 1% of GDP there, so I mean, you know, cutting back further it wouldn't have made much difference anyway. But in China, military spending doesn't affect economic growth greatly because the army is largely self-supporting. So that's an important point to know. In China, the army runs its own farms, factories and everything, which obviously helps it to continue or to sustain itself. And this makes China's military spending a little bit more difficult to calculate. In the 1980s and 1990s, the Chinese military forces underwent substantial reduction, along with modernization, of course, and recently it started growing again. So the Chinese army does remain the weakest sort of all the great power militaries because it lags in technology, but it's improving very quickly, all the time basically. Right, so let's move on to military spending now. What determines military spending? First of all, it's important to remember. So let's look now at what determines military spending. Okay, now, first of all, it's important to remember that choices of military forces had traditionally depended on the connection between military spending and a state's military spending and its economic health, right? So, in fact, not so long ago, it was widely believed in the US that war is good for the economy. But if this was indeed the case, then state leaders wouldn't have difficult choices to make in setting high military budgets, right? Because high military spending would give them more military capabilities for use in international conflicts, as well as more economic growth for domestic needs, including buying popular and political support in various ways, right? But the reality of the fact is that economics of military spending is not so favorable. In the long term, or the longer term, allocating economic resources for military purposes really deprives the rest of the economy and reduces its growth. And that's the reality of it, okay? Now let me explain a little bit about what I mean there, okay? So high technology military development, which uses engineers, scientists, and technicians, etc., tends to deprive the civilian sectors of talent and technology because you're sucking it all into the high technology military sectors, and then taking them away from other areas of society that need them, right, like bridge building and engineering and all these other areas in health and medical technology, etc. And also, military spending is more capital intensive and less labor intensive, which means that there are fewer jobs than in education, housing, and construction, etc. So what you should really be doing as a state is plowing more money into these other areas and not into just military, because military is less labor intensive. So you're not going to get a high employment rate there. And then conversely, reductions in military spending tend to free up economic resources for more productive purposes and strengthens the economy or the growth of the economy in the longer term. So these are important things to consider. Now, obviously, in the long term, state leaders face a trade-off then between increasing their available military leverage, all right, and increasing their overall economic health in their states. But of course, in this scenario, there is one actual variable we haven't spoken about, which is, hello, real warfare, which magnifies both the long-term and short-term effects of military spending. Okay, first of all, obviously, it immediately stimulates high military spending, because if you're involved in a war, you're going to want to spend money on military so that you have arms and you have, the people involved that you need to have involved. But at the same time, it destroys capital, because it destroys people, cities, farms, factories, and causes inflation by reducing the supply of various goods while increasing demands for them, which is a problem. Now, in most cases, when war breaks out, governments have to pay for the war goods, and so they do it in three key ways mostly, all right? First of all, by borrowing money, but they increase the government debt by doing this, obviously, okay, but they do it. Two, they can then print more currency as well, but that fuels inflation. And they can also raise taxes, which reduces spending and investment, which is a problem, and also the people are more annoyed about it, depending on whether or not they're behind the war, of course. In many cases, this can have a very detrimental effect on the economic health of a country, which is clearly evidenced by the economic collapse in the US from 2008 onwards with the bubble that burst. Okay. Now, obviously, the economic problem wasn't just about the banks, etc. It was obviously also attributed to the ongoing wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But even then, they were not the only reason for the collapse, but they obviously played a huge role. There were other, as I said before, other reasons around the banks, etc., and the economy generally. But the military spending and the US involvement in all these wars obviously played a huge role. Okay. But now, on the other hand, believe it or not, war and high military spending can actually have certain economic benefits, and we should talk about those, okay? So as mentioned above, there can be a short-term stimulation, which results from a boost in military spending. There's acquisition of territory, which obviously could be important. That could contain resources and capital. But this is obviously quite controversial because it's like a colonialist thought pattern, that you go to war and then you gather territory and gain territory. Or it's something sort of like that Hitler would do in World War II. And while we're on Hitler, let's talk about the examples of the fortunes that Hitler and his Nazis made from the plunder of the 6 million Jews that were killed and those that were interned in the concentration camps. When they made millions out of these people that they killed. But anyway, another economic benefit would be patriotism. So it can stir up a population's patriotism so that they will work harder for less pay. All right. But however, even with these sort of minute benefits, overall, the benefits rarely equal the economic costs of war, which are much, much, much worse. Just wanted to show you a quick picture on the next slide. This is just an example of all the rings that the Nazis took off Jewish people who were in the camps during World War II. Also have a look at this cartoon quickly. That's very true. Sorry, America, but there it is. Okay.